It is to the end of you're watching Dante's Boxing Nation. Keep watching. Otherwise,
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So it was finally officially reported that the Crawford versus Postol pay-per-view numbers were projected to be around 50 to 60,000 pay-per-view buys, according to ESPN's Dan Raphael. The first thing I want to say about this news is, if you guys notice, even Dan Raphael, as biased as ESPN and Dan Raphael is, notice they didn't report this news until it was official. They didn't go off of rumors, speculation. They only reported this news once it was official. And that is the exact reason why I'm doing the same thing and reporting these numbers right now, because now they are official. So with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about these pay-per-view numbers for the Crawford versus Postol fight. Now, the second thing I want to say is, guys, this is the exact reason why Bob Arum is talking about taking his biggest stars from HBO to Showtime. Why? Because HBO, according to Bob Arum, HBO is running out of money and they do not have the funds to pay for slots for fighters like Terence Crawford and Lomachenko to fight on HBO. I told you guys this before and I will keep telling you this. The reason why we didn't see the Nicholas Walters versus Lomachenko fight was not because one of the fighters didn't want the fight. It was because HBO could not afford to put the fight on regular TV. You see, there's a misconception, and this is something that even I used to think before. I used to think that fighters that put, or promoters that put their fighters on pay-per-view, they were doing that because they had more money to invest. But actually, it's the contrary. When you see fights on HBO, those fights are on HBO because HBO is paying for that slot for those fighters to fight on HBO. When HBO cannot afford to put those fighters on regular HBO, then promoters like Bob Arum, he has to come out of his own pockets and he has to put that fight on pay-per-view. Okay? So with that being said, when it comes to the Crawford situation, I want you guys to understand this. And this is what I love about YouTube. Everything that I say is well documented. You can go back to all of my videos and you can see that I have always been consistent. You can never go back and play a clip and show a clip of Dante contradicting himself. You can't do it. Everything that I have said has been completely consistent. Even when it comes to someone like Boxing Ego, and I use him as an example because he speaks the truth as well. And the reason why I tell you guys this is because, you see, the difference from Crawford being on pay-per-view versus Gennady Golovkin, Canelo Alvarez is Crawford versus Postol, that fight was never supposed to be on pay-per-view. You guys have heard me say it before. You guys have heard Boxing Ego say it before. You've heard other people that on my panel on a radio show, Arab King, he said it before. We have all said this fight should not be on pay-per-view. This fight should be on regular HBO. And when we first found out it was on pay-per-view, I didn't understand why it was. And then Bob Arum, he explained it. He said HBO did not have the money. They couldn't afford to put this fight on regular HBO. So I had to come out of my own pocket because I didn't want my fighters like Viktor Postol, Crawford, I didn't want them to sit on the shelf. So I came out of my own pocket to put this fight on pay-per-view. Now let me go ahead and break this down for you guys and distinguish the dichotomy between Terence Crawford and Gennady Golovkin's situation when Golovkin was on pay-per-view. When it came to Gennady Golovkin's situation, Team Golovkin, the promoters, and everybody, including even the fans, they were telling us that Golovkin was a superstar. And Golovkin's own promoter, he was telling us we're expecting numbers to be anywhere from 250 to 300,000. Anything below 200,000 would be a failure. These are the expectations that Team Golovkin set, okay? That is the difference. The difference is Team Golovkin, they elected to fight on pay-per-view. And when it comes to people like me, I said this fight should not be on pay-per-view. I said the same thing about the Terence Crawford fight. Once again, the difference is Terence Crawford and Bob Arum, they were forced to put their fight on pay-per-view. Tom Loeffler and Golovkin, they elected to put their fight on pay-per-view. Do you guys see the difference? So there were no expectations when it came to Terence Crawford because there was no one saying Terence Crawford, he needs to be on pay-per-view. You never heard me or anyone else say this fight should be on pay-per-view and I'm expecting the numbers to be anywhere from 150,000 to 500,000. You never heard me say that. So if I, from the beginning, said this fight should not have been on pay-per-view, and Bob Arum from the beginning said this fight wasn't supposed to be on pay-per-view, you can't come back and say to me or Bob Arum or whoever put this fight together, you can't say, hey, what happened to those numbers you guys were expecting? Because there were no expectations. Because once again, Terence Crawford and Bob Arum, they didn't want to put this fight on pay-per-view. They had no choice. Once again, when you look at the Gennady Golovkin situation and you hear Tom Loeffler saying, not only is it time to put Golovkin on pay-per-view, but I expect these type of numbers. So of course, if I say, hey, this fight shouldn't be on pay-per-view, Golovkin versus Lemieux, this should be on HBO, right? And then of course, once the numbers come out and they turn out to be much lower than Golovkin's promoter expected them to be or projected them to be, then of course I'm going to say, this is the reason why this fight should have not been on pay-per-view. Now, something else needs to be noted. Notice after the poor numbers, the poor Golovkin versus Lemieux numbers, HBO employees got fired because they went with the hype and they decided to put that fight on pay-per-view. They got fired because of their poor decision of putting that fight on pay-per-view. But notice when it came to Crawford versus Postol numbers, nobody got fired. Why? Because for the 1,000th time, Crawford and Bob Arum, they were forced to put this fight on pay-per-view by HBO. Okay? Let me give you guys a real basic analogy. Let's say, for example, I'm at a karaoke bar, right? And there's someone sitting there, and for whatever reason, me and a couple buddies, we tell this girl, go up there and sing. And she says, oh, but I'm not really that good of a singer. I mean, I do a little karaoke, but I'm not ready to make that kind of jump and, you know, sing on stage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not really that good, right? And we say, no, you're gonna get up there and you're gonna sing right now. And she says, okay. She gets up there and she sings. And it turns out she doesn't have the worst voice in the world, but it's clear she ain't no Beyonce, okay? So it's not the best and it's not the worst, but it doesn't really stand out. Now, just use common sense in this situation. After you done forced this girl to get on stage and sing, would you criticize her? Would you tell her how bad she is and compare it to Beyonce, she ain't nothing, et cetera, et cetera? You wouldn't do that, right? because of the simple fact that you forced her to get on the stage. So there really was no expectations. But if this girl were to come to you and she were to say, let me get on that stage, I'm about to show out everybody. Beyonce ain't got nothing on me, right? And you get up on that stage and you don't sound that good at all, right? You ain't nowhere near a Beyonce. Then you are going to get criticized a lot, and you deserve to be criticized because you sold something that wasn't there, right? That is the stark contrast between Crawford Postol and a Golovkin versus Lemieux. When they put that Golovkin on pay-per-view, that Golovkin versus Lemieux fight, you had people, promoters, and everyone saying that Golovkin is the savior of boxing, and after Floyd Mayweather destroyed the sport, Golovkin is going to be the one that's going to save the sport. He's going to revive the sport. This is what fans were saying, right? It's time for him to be on pay-per-view. He's going to be the next pay-per-view king, etc., etc. This is the reason why fans would criticize Team Golovkin more than they would criticize Terence Crawford going up against Viktor Postol. No one said Terence Crawford was about to replace Floyd Mayweather financially, right? We all knew the fact that you have Terence Crawford, who has never fought on pay-per-view before. All of a sudden, he's fighting on pay-per-view, and he's fighting against a guy that the majority of fans have never heard of. A lot of people did not know who Viktor Postol was. I'm not talking about the diehard fans. I'm talking about just the basic boxing fans. They did not know who Viktor Postol was. And this is the reason why there were no expectations. You know, I remember right before the fight, a day before the fight, I believe, I talked to Bob Arum, and I asked him, what did he expect the numbers to be? And you know what Bob Arum said? He said, I don't know. He said, I don't know. I mean, the bottom line is HBO, they forced us to put this on pay-per-view. So I don't know what the numbers are going to be. They could be anything. This is what Bob Arum told me directly. All right. Now keep in mind, when Bob Arum puts Manny Pacquiao on pay-per-view, what do we often hear? We often hear him giving an outrageous projection, or I won't even say outrageous, but he will put a number on what he expects those pay-per-views to be, right? He'll say, I expect Pacquiao versus Algieri to be anywhere from 800,000 or something like that, right? When it came to this situation, Bob Arum said, I don't know what the numbers are going to be. They could be anything, because he was forced to put this fight on pay-per-view. So when it comes to you decafs, you can't sit over here and say, hey, what happened to Crawford's numbers? Because no one said the numbers were going to be this amount or that amount. I mean, you can't put a gun to someone's head and tell them to fight on pay-per-view, and then once the numbers are not what you expected them to be, then all of a sudden you're upset with them. And you say, hey man, how come you didn't get these amount of numbers? Well, I told you that this fight wasn't supposed to be on pay-per-view in the first place. So now, as I told you guys at the beginning of the video, Bob Arum, he's trying to take his biggest stars over to Showtime to prevent things like this happening again. You know, I told you guys at the beginning of this video, when it comes to Dan Rafael, there's no doubt about it. Dan Rafael is one of the most racially biased media writers and members of the media in the sport of boxing today. But with that being said, even Dan Rafael, he did not report this until he got more of an official number, right? As opposed to just getting speculated numbers that are nothing but rumors. And this is the same thing I did when it came to Golovkin pay-per-view numbers, when it came to Canelo's pay-per-view numbers, when it came to whoever's pay-per-view numbers. I reported the news when the numbers were more factual numbers. That's pretty much all I got, guys. I'm on to the next one.